Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Where today we are going to ask a question. How do renegade space marines come into existence? Not as in how are they, created, Demon Collabo style, but rather how loyal space marines fall to chaos. Although in some cases they haven't even quite fallen to chaos, they've merely simply realized that they are the biggest boys on the block, and can therefore take whatever they want. Now, we all know, of course, the names of the traitor legions, those who turned against the light of the Emperor during the Horus heresy, the Emperor's children, the Word-bearers, the Death Guard, and so on. But in the 10,000 years since, countless other traitor warbands have been created. Some have simply been created as break-offs of those main traitor legions. The Emperor's children, for example, have spawned the Perfecti, the Exquisite Host, the Lacerators, the Vibrant Choristry, and the 12th Company, along with dozens upon dozens of other breakaway bands. These are usually created over internal disagreements within the larger legion, which formed aplenty after the defeat of the heretic legions after the Siege of Terra, especially after the fall of many of the demon primarchs or their full-scale retreat into the Eye of Terror. Bereft of a single, central, unquestionable leadership figure, countless other champions arose to take command of their own splinter groups of the Legion. But we're not going to focus too much on these, because they are still, in essence, merely a facet of their parent traitor legion. The question today is, what creates a renegade astartes in the more modern-day version of the 41st millennium? So not a splinter of one of the heretic legions, but rather one created thereafter. Let's begin with one of the most common ones, shall we? Simple chaos corruption. And we will begin with the most brutish and bludgeoning version, that which simply turns loyal astartes into monsters, as corruption can take many forms. Indeed, appealing to a noble soul's virtue can often be the quickest way to see it fall. But in many cases, such subterfuge is simply not necessary, as even the purest of soul can be bent and broken to the service of the dark gods if simply exposed to enough of chaos's warping, corrupting power. Or, well, technically, there are a couple of exceptions to that rule as well, but for now, we'll stick to the more general examples. It does, of course, take a lot to corrupt a member of the adeptus astartes in most cases, but there are certainly instances in which a lot is, well, a mere understatement, really. For example, during the early years of the 37th millennium, the year 321 to be precise, and the commencement of the Abyssal Crusade. This mad endeavor that would see 30 chapters of the Adeptus Astartes sent on a penitent crusade into the Eye of Terror was the culmination of the Age of Redemption, a long period within the Imperium where the ecclesiarchy ran rampant in order to attempt to redeem the Imperium for its countless perceived sins against the God Emperor. During these purges, the aforementioned 30 chapters were deemed to be suspect, insufficiently pure, and were ordered by the imperial Saint Basilius to commence a penitent crusade into the Eye of Terror, to cleanse the Imperium once and for all of the taint of chaos. It was a hopeless order, of course, and in later years it has largely been accepted that Saint Basilius himself was an agent of chaos working to weaken the Imperium. At least, those were the accusations launched against his remnants after one of the chapter masters of the 30 chapters returned in the 38th millennium, declaring that the entire scheme had been a huge setup. Now, the penitent crusade into the Eye of Terror did succeed in purging several hundred planets of its chaos populace, destroying countless millions, if not billions, of chaos heretic slaves. Not to mention a vast number of chaos space marines and enemy warships and other vessels, and a truly titanic quantity of materiel. But as time and space flows differently within the Eye, it is highly debatable whether or not that actually achieved anything at all. What cannot be debated, however, is that when the Space Marines re-emerged, a full 25 out of the 30 chapters had fallen to the influence of the dark gods. The only silver lining being that at least those chapters too had been mauled to a devastating degree by their lengthy campaign within the Eye. And so, in all due likelihood, the resultant warbands consisted of no more than a few hundred individual astartes. Even then, that meant that hundreds of the Emperor's finest warriors had been sacrificed to chaos for no gains whatsoever. Indeed, chaos activity out of the Eye of Terror, which had admittedly dipped during the Abyssal Crusade itself, now increased tenfold, as dozens of fleets of fully prepared Chaos Raiders were now at the beck and call of their new masters. This, obviously, is a method of corruption that is as brutal as it is blunt, and, thankfully, a relatively rare one. Seeing as the Imperium has been engaged in the containment of the Eye of Terror for a very long time now, it is generally understood that deployment within the Eye of Terror, or its nearby areas, more correctly, needs to be for limited periods of time only. For the Space Marines, that means that they are assigned to various organizations of wardens, which will watch over the Eye and defend the Imperial planets nearby for a cycle of a few decades, mayhaps even as much as a few hundred years, depending upon their general rate of exposure, before they are then rotated back out again. As for Imperial Guard regiments, well, they're less fortunate, and usually dealt with via orbital bombardment, rather than being rotated back out again. But there have, of course, also been examples of this kind of exposure corrupting chapters far outside of the Eye of Terror as well. Entire chapters apparently having gone suddenly and brutally mad, for no apparent reason, even to the extent of butchering the populace of their own chapter worlds. But these instances are extraordinarily rare. More often, these apparent sudden turns of allegiance are due to unfortunately overlooked rituals and practices of significance that the Imperium was simply not aware of at the time. The Ecclesiarchy tolerates many different beliefs in the God Emperor throughout the Imperium, Technically, there is only one correct way to believe in the Emperor, and only one correct way to worship him, as determined by the ecclesiarchy, but the realities of an enormous galaxy-spanning empire makes this a bit more complicated. And so, local variants on the belief system are largely tolerated. Say, for example, a civilization that worships the Emperor as the sun, or as some form of a totemic deity, for example. In many cases, the God Emperor is also influenced by local customs, such as by being given sacrifices. On an agricultural world, this might be the entirely innocent tradition of offering up grain to the God Emperor. On more savage worlds, it might be dedicating kills of prey animals to the God Emperor, committing their souls to his eternal throne. And on more barbaric worlds still, there may even be outright human sacrifices and blood rituals that can still be within the teachings of the ecclesiarchy and still be, honestly, for the God Emperor. But there are also occasions in which the Emperor is not the actual target of these offerings, where local, monstrous deities adopt the visage of the Emperor to fool the ever-watchful eyes of the ecclesiarchy. Now again, the ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition tend to be quite thorough with these things, but there are several worlds and several chapters indeed that have been allowed to carry out rather special rituals for a very long time, either in secret, fearing what might happen if these rituals are ever discovered, or in the open, assuming that they've managed to build up enough goodwill. For example, there are many successor chapters of the Blood Angels that have rituals that would be considered deeply disturbing by the standards of the rest of the Imperium. And yet these chapters are nearly to a man loyalist chapters. And it doesn't even have to be something crazy like blood sacrifice or personally slaughtering a thrall for every astartes, for example, and drinking their blood through gushing neck wounds, like certain Blood Angel successor chapters. In some cases, like that of the Shining Blades, it was simply hubris. The Shining Blades was once a loyalist chapter of Astartes that had a remarkable track record of victories. They were lauded throughout the local sectors. They were paragons of virtue and martial excellence, and they appeared to be completely loyal. In fact, if anything, they appeared to be a pristine chapter. However, over the course of decades and centuries of praise and laudits, they grew utterly self-assured to the point of clear arrogance. So that when they are later questioned by other Imperial forces as to whether or not it was quite necessary to persecute a war to quite the extent and quite the fashion that they had chosen, the Shining Blades turned their weapons on their allies, outraged at being questioned. This was the event of the Beryllia Massacre, where after first turning their weapons upon their allies, the Shining Blades are then confronted by the Red Scorpions, a chapter themselves known quite well for hunting down impurities and for obeying orders from the God Emperor without the slightest hint of doubt or question. When they saw a wrong to be righted, they would not back down, and the Shining Blades, completely assured of their own superiority, would not back down either. The conflict was at that point inevitable, and the two forces waged a cataclysmic war which drove the Shining Blades to their final extreme of excess, forming them from loyal warband to Chaos Space Marines, fleeing the battle and renaming themselves the Flawless Host. The seeds of this disaster were long in the growing and readily available to those with eyes to see, but can you blame a chapter for taking pride in its victories? Should the Inquisition persecute them merely for being good at what they do? Of course not. And one might also very well argue that the Flawless Host were probably afflicted by other dreadful influences as well, rather than merely just pride, as one would think that merely feeling good about oneself would not lead to such a mighty fall. But on the other hand, that is where Slaanesha's promises begin, where his lies start. The Slaanesh is a deity that merely asks you to take a little more pleasure in the everyday acts that you already experience. And the Imperium cannot be too aggressive in its enforcement either, because there are also several examples of loyalist chapters being suspected of taint, quite so without actually having any, that were then driven straight into the hands of chaos. Take, for example, the fate of the Night Reapers chapter. They had been sent to guard the Lana Rift region. This was a region of space that had long been exposed to Chaos Raiders, and keeping it safe and secure would be a pretty significant task. During a major Chaos offensive into the region, the Night Reapers were sent to the aid of a local shrine world, a holy place where the honored dead from across the Imperium were interred. The Night Reapers initially set about their task with determination, but after an enormous, overwhelming force, both of Chaos Space Marines and endless numbers of renegade Imperial Guardsmen and treacherous mutants descended upon the world, the Night Reapers elected to withdraw, rather than defending the Shrine World to the last battle brother. They lured as many of the enemy's forces down onto its surface as they could, before pulling back up into orbit and launching massed orbital strikes against the thronged enemy forces, inflicting incalculable damage upon the invaders, but also annihilating huge portions of the Shrine World's surface, including titanic sacred basilicas that had stood for millennia. Tactically and strategically, the Night Reapers were not in error. They were faced with a significantly larger enemy force, one which they could not hope to defeat with conventional means. Retreating off-world and inflicting mass casualties from orbit before relaunching offensives to cleanse the planet were absolutely the most effective measures that they could have taken. However, the destruction of so many priceless religious artifacts and areas of enormous significance to the ecclesiarchy saw that most honored of institutions lobby the High Lords of Terror to officially censor the Night Reapers. Who were rewarded for their heroics then by being stripped of their chapter homeworld, all of their holdings, and being sent on a penitent crusade to the outer fringes of the Rift region, where within another 20 years they had turned their guns upon the Imperium they had once sworn to protect, becoming pirates, raiders, and marauders, no doubt due to mounting discontent with what they viewed as an unreasonable punishment and a slight upon their honor. The number of reasons they could have picked to turn traitor were countless, and one might certainly argue that they might have been destined to turn traitor forever, for what loyal Space Marine chapter would willingly abandon a shrine world and destroy it as well, regardless of the strategic necessity to do so? On the other hand, it is also far from guaranteed that they would ever have turned if the Imperium had thanked them for their actions, instead of sending them on a penitent crusade where they would eventually come to occupy a space hulk, which are not known for their wholesome environments. Eventually, the Night Reapers would be hunted down and destroyed by a force of Grey Knights and Minotaur Space Marines, ever the High Lords of Terror's loyal attack dogs. And the High Lords of Terror have certainly created more than their fair share of Chaos Renegade chapters as well, either through justifiable reasons, not so justifiable power struggles, or simple disagreements. I did a whole series, of course, on the Badab War and how the Astral Claws, through the most high-minded and noble reasons, chose to violate the Codex Astartes. The Astral Claws genuinely wanted to save their brethren. They wanted to protect the Imperium, and the best way to do that in their mind, well, it simply required far more resources than they were allowed to possess. And combined this with the constant haranguing of various Terran organizations, they simply elected to take the safety of the Imperium into their own hands, and may very well have done so to the best of their abilities as well, but the High Lords were not fond of a chapter growing so far beyond its designated numbers, until eventually, at the end of the Badab War, they were driven out of the Badab sector to become the Red Corsairs, piratical raiders that plague the Imperium to this day. Or again, disagreements, often violent disagreements, as seen with the Relictors chapter. See, the Relictors were not fond of demons. They hated demons with every iota of their souls. They wished to find a way to eradicate demons wherever they were, and with whatever means necessary. Perhaps inspired by the unflexible zeal of their alleged Primarch, Lionel Johnson, they sought therefore to find the most effective weapons imaginable. And it turns out that the best way to defeat a demon is with another demon. The Relictors began to delve into forbidden knowledge, stealing forbidden weapons and tomes from places where they were held in safeguard by other chapters, by other imperial entities, even by the Inquisition, and in so doing murdering a fair few imperial servants as well. But at the same time, the Relictors did indeed prove very effective against chaos, to the point where initially they were lauded as some of the Imperium's foremost defenders against the most hideous threats of the warp, having directly been responsible for several notable victories around the Eye of Terror. But their extracurricular activities soon came to light. The Inquisition declared them excommunicatus traitoris and dispatched the Grey Knights to wipe them out. They did so with their usual efficiency, forcing the handful of remaining Relictors to flee into the Eye of Terror, where they have presumably perished. The Relictors, of course, did what they did for power, and whether or not they were truly corrupted, and evidence suggests they were not. Most Space Marines will understand the need for bigger guns, for better weapons, for more strength with which to vanquish their foes. And a fair few have fallen to that temptation as well. The Soul Drinkers chapter, for example, is one of the most famous one of these, where the Soul Drinkers, during a massive fight against a huge Nurgle hive, embraced gifts from the Emperor, giving them strength beyond that of even the most ferocious astartes, arms of massed chitinous flesh, psychic abilities beyond that of any librarian, supernatural reflexes, and magically enhanced weaponry that seem tailor-made to destroy the God Emperor's foes. With gifts like these to crush their foes, how could they be anything but blessings from the God Emperor himself, intervening on behalf of his favored sons? Although the Chief Librarian Sarpedon's lower half bursting open into spider legs, it really should have been a hint that maybe the God Emperor wasn't directly responsible for this. But the ego does ever protect itself from things seemingly designed to shatter it. And it turned out, of course, that the Soul Drinkers were being manipulated by a greater demon of Tzeentch. Again, perhaps they should have seen this coming, but they're hardly the only ones to have fallen prey to the machinations of the Great Schemer, and on occasion not even due to promises of power. For example, another loyalist chapter called the Seekers of Truth were known for their honorable nature and straightforward dignity. They were led by a man who embodied every principle of virtue for which the Astartes should stand so very proud, Gallus Herodicus. Unfortunately for him, he found himself as a pawn of the Inquisition. The God Emperor's most holy servants can, of course, at any time requisition the aid of any Imperial force, be it Guard, Space Marine, Imperial Navy, PDF, or otherwise. In this case, the Seekers of Truth found themselves so requisitioned to crush various uprisings that had taken place in their area of space. However, the Inquisition's police actions can often be a bit much. Some Inquisitors can act as scalpels, cutting out corruption carefully and concisely. Others feel it is much better to burn a village rather than risk a heretic escaping. Seeing his chapter be used for such bloody butcher's work weighed heavily on Herodicus's mind, and every operation against targets he knew to not be worthy of their attentions continued to damage his trust in the Inquisition and the Imperium. Until one day, when praying to the God Emperor for guidance, he received an answer. As the Soul Drinkers have taught us, if the God Emperor ever starts speaking to you, stop listening immediately. As yet again, it wasn't actually that Big E had taken a personal interest in Herodicus. It was yet again a servant of Tzeentch who granted Herodicus and all of his number with the gift of hearing every lie that issued forth from mankind's lips. The once noble commander, now faced with the sheer mind-crushing weight of humanity's dishonesty went a little crazy and killed the Inquisitor, killed all the other Imperials around, and dedicated themselves to the Changer of Ways, taking up the name of the Scourged to do so. As I said, sometimes it may be better to prey on a strong man's virtue than his weakness. In other cases, a weakness might simply just be gold or other riches, as yes indeed, that too has been the motivation for chapters to turn renegade. Or even just individual astartes. See, it doesn't always have to be a mass movement, as is the case of a man by the name of Adhoran. He used to be a captain with the Sons of Guilliman. However, at some unknown point in his career, he clearly decided that he could have anything he wanted because he was a lot bigger than everyone else around him, and broke from the chapter, leaving into spaces unknown to gather around himself other like-minded individuals, building his own little Reaver fleet of outcast astartes, now called Adharon's Reavers. Other renegade marines may have had similar notions. Not all of them are even dedicated to chaos, as there are outcasts of chapters that have simply determined that the God Emperor is not what is right for them, but nor are the chaos gods. Although, these are rare, very rare, and, well, technically, Count Vulcan amongst their numbers. So, there's that. Anyways, that is a by no means exhaustive list of all the ways in which loyal astartes could turn traitor, or renegade, as again, not all of them are necessarily turning to chaos proper, but they are certainly turning away from the light of the Imperium, that's for certain. Hopefully, you'll have learned something new today. And until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.